Hello and welcome. In this video tutorial, I'll introduce you to my collection of marker brushes and show you how to get the most out of them in your digital artwork. We'll start by exploring how to use these digital markers to create smooth, textured, and dynamic strokes, perfect for illustrations that mimic traditional marker techniques. Then we'll dive into a step-by-step tutorial where I'll guide you through drawing a tomato, demonstrating the layering, blending, and shading techniques that will bring your illustration to life. Also, don't forget to install the canvas that is included in the collection with the brushes. This canvas enhances the effect of the brushes and makes them more realistic. I'll set the color palette as default and move it to the workspace to make it easier to change colors. Let's start with the first brush, Fine Tip Bold Line. If you have ever used Copic markers or other markers, you may have noticed that they have a round base with a thin tip. This is the most common base. I use this brush as my main brush to paint over the base. I tried to make this brush as similar to the original brush as possible, and keep that mark that appears when you press down on the brush. The next brush, Medium Broadline Brush. The marker usually has two tips. One side is the same as the first brush and the other has a rectangular base. The more pressure you apply to the brush, the more intense the shade will be. And the next brush is a wide brush. This brush is similar to the previous one but has a wider base. It is great for making beautiful strokes, like the one I used under the chair. The next brush is a fine tip thin line. This brush is essentially the same as the first one, but used from a different angle. To achieve a stroke similar to the first brush, you would tilt the marker at a 45-degree angle. However, to replicate the effect of this brush, you would hold the marker at a 90-degree angle. Classic Fine Line Brush. This brush is more for detail. It doesn't change the thickness of the line, but the more pressure you apply, the more saturated it becomes, like all the other brushes. The dry marker brush mimics the texture of a real dry marker, offering a rough, textured stroke perfect for adding a natural, hand-drawn feel to your illustrations. Ideal for sketching or adding subtle details. The airbrush offers smooth, seamless gradients and soft shading, perfect for creating depth and blending colors. Its smooth application makes it ideal for adding light touches, highlights, or atmospheric effects to your illustrations. The blending brush is great for removing borders between strokes. Ideal for creating soft gradients, subtle textures, and refined details, it helps achieve a polished, cohesive look while maintaining the natural flow of your illustration. The multi-liner brush set includes three versatile tools: pen, brush, and calligraphy. The pen brush offers precise, clean lines perfect for detailed work. The brush tool provides dynamic, expressive strokes, great for creating fluid textures. The calligraphy brush is tailored for elegant lettering and flowing strokes, ideal for adding a stylish touch to your designs. Now that you're more familiar with the brushes, it should be easier to choose the right one when you're painting. And now let's try to draw this tomato using marker brushes. This sketch, color palette, and reference photo are included in this lesson. I will also be using the canvas that is included in the collection with the brushes. Let's set the layer opacity to 50% and select the drawing layer. Let's add a reference photo to the workspace. Select Actions, then Canvas, Reference, Image, and Import Image. Let's start with the first brush, Fine Tip Bold Line, and work with lighter colors. My technique when using marker brushes is slightly different from watercolor. Instead of applying bold, saturated colors immediately, I prefer to build up layers gradually. By layering colors, we can achieve a more nuanced result, with beautiful shimmering tones and greater depth of color. This method may take a little more time, but the variety of shades and richness of depth are well worth the effort. As you can see, the third shade I chose is the more saturated shade in the palette, but with light pressure on the brush, it is still as light and translucent as the first two. First, we'll draw the base and then choose a blend brush to blend the edges. Select the fine tip bold line brush again and continue to build up volume. Using the second shade in the color palette and a light brush stroke, I will fill the left side of the tomato with color. I now select the third shade and start with light pressure at the top, and gradually increase the pressure towards the bottom of the tomato. I apply the same process to the remaining shades, layering them carefully, and then blend the colors seamlessly using a blending brush. This technique helps to create smooth transitions and enhances the overall depth and richness of the final illustration. In the photo reference, we can see that the light source is coming from the left, meaning the left side of the tomato will appear lighter than the right side. I always make sure to apply lighter shades to the side where the light hits, while using darker tones on the opposite side to create depth and dimension. And now we'll blend the colors again using the blending brush. As we apply multiple layers, you'll notice that the tomato gradually gains more volume and depth, with each layer building on the previous one. Now, we are approaching the final series of layers. These last few layers will refine the overall look, bringing out the final highlights and shadows to make the tomato feel complete. Let's select medium broadline brush. This brush has a rectangular base and I like to use it for beautiful final strokes. Select the blending brush to soften the edges of our strokes. Select the Fine Tip Thin Line brush. This brush is great for drawing details and when you need to fill in smaller elements. This brush has a fine tip and changes the thickness of the line as you apply pressure. Now I'm going to choose a darker shade and draw the same line around the outline of the object on the right and bottom. We can easily darken or lighten any areas. First, draw the shape we want and then soften the edges using the blending brush. The tomato is already looking vibrant and has gained a nice sense of volume. Now let's add the tomato branch to enhance the composition. For this detail, we'll use the Fine Tip Thin Line brush, an excellent choice for rendering finer, more delicate elements. As always, I will start with the lighter shades and move smoothly to the darker and more saturated shades. For watercolor illustration, the focus is on building transparent layers to create soft blended tones that flow seamlessly into each other. With markers, we work more on layering opaque shades, often overlapping for richer saturation. Now let's blend the colors in some areas using the blending brush, and before these, reduce the size to 40 to 50%. The base for the branch is complete, and now we need to make it more expressive by adding shadows using the fine tip thin line brush and darker shades of green. Let's create a new layer on top of the drawing layer and select the first brush, Fine Tip Bold Line Brush. We will use the new layer to draw highlights. I'll apply a few strokes and then soften the edges using the blending brush. And then I'll select the fine tip thin line brush and draw highlights from the left side of the tomato. Highlights are essential in illustration because they bring depth, dimension, and realism to the artwork. They mimic the way light interacts with surfaces, making objects look three-dimensional and helping guide the viewer's eye to important details. By carefully placing these highlights, we can make our illustration more dynamic and lifelike, giving each element a polished, professional finish. Using a reference photo is invaluable when studying highlights and shadows. It provides a clear guide to understanding light and shadow placement, helping to capture depth, contrast, and realism in your work. We can hide the sketch layer and select the drawing layer to add details for the branch using the classic fine line brush. I'll select a darker shade and reduce the brush size. I'll set the brush size to 9%. The tomato branch currently lacks sharpness, giving it a slightly blurred appearance. To enhance its clarity and make the details more defined, let's add contrasting accent lines along the edges of the leaves. This technique will bring a crisper outline, making the branch visually stand out and adding depth to the illustration. To refine the leaf details, sharpen the tips of each leaf for a more precise, natural look. Additionally, apply a shorter line along the left side of each leaf, where the light source is softer, and a longer, more defined line on the right side, where shadows deepen. This subtle contrast between the lengths of the lines will create a more realistic effect, enhancing the sense of depth and dimension in areas with greater shade. We can also add texture to the branch using the hatching method. For example, like this, by drawing some lines. With these details, the branch and tomato now appear three-dimensional and fully detailed. To enhance this effect, we can add a shadow beneath the tomato to give the impression of it resting naturally on a surface. For this, I'll create a new layer positioned below the main drawing layer, allowing us to paint the shadow without interfering with the existing illustration. This added shadow will further ground the tomato, creating depth and a more lifelike composition. I'll select the medium broadline brush and a gray shade. First draw an oval shape and then repeat a couple times, slightly reducing its size. So the shadow closer to the tomato will be more contrasting, and then blend the colors using a blending brush. And let's make the edges of the shadow a little softer too. Throughout the process, we explored the basics of layering lighter and darker tones, blending for smooth transitions, and adding important highlights and shadows to bring your work to life. Understanding how to apply layers gradually and build saturation allowed you to add depth and realism to the tomato's surface. Using finer lines and controlled strokes, you enhanced the finer details, such as the texture of the tomato and the delicate lines in the twig. Adding final highlights and adjusting contrast added dimension to the illustration, while creating a soft shadow under the tomato added realism and anchored it to the surface. With these techniques in mind, you can confidently use these brushes to add realistic texture, depth, and vibrancy to your own work. Practice with different fruits, vegetables, or objects to further develop your skills, and discover how these brushes can add new layers of realism to your digital illustrations. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I can't wait to see how you use these techniques in your next projects.